All right. Welcome to, I know, the far less entertaining part 2. Scholars talking about the Mexican Revolution. But we hope to raise some interesting questions and provide some new perspectives about Mexico and the region of Veracruz, and filmmaking in Mexico in the next 2 sessions. And then, as I said earlier, we will return to music. Our experience is we're probably not going to mess with microphones. You can hear us. We're going to have conversations rather than do all sorts of other things today. This is a pre-introduction. I'm John Tutino. I have the great pleasure of coordinating the Americas Initiative here at Georgetown. And so I want to welcome you all. I want to thank Anja Dillerglenis and Joe Horowitz of the Post-Classical Ensemble for coordinating and helping this event happen. I want to particularly thank and welcome to Georgetown, Laura Ramirez Rascalo, the director of the Mexican Culture. And coordinate so much of this series and make so much happen in this city about Mexico. And for anybody who doesn't know about the Mexican Cultural Institute and hasn't visited them, they're on 16th Street. And it is a wonderful place with its own built-in murals, art exhibits, programs. You should know about it and visit it. I will then simply pass the floor. I want to introduce Sarah Bosco, who's a lecturer in Latin American Studies at Queen's University Belfast. She is with us today, thanks to the fact that Georgetown has a program coordinated with Queen's University, and she's a wonderful scholar of Mexican literature in the very period that we're talking about. And Sarah will chair our first session.
Thank you very much, John. Yes, so the first session today, as John has already hinted, is called Rethinking Revolution in Mexico and Veracruz. And it's my pleasure to introduce, or to reintroduce, I think perhaps more correctly, Rodolfo Fernandez. The reason I say reintroduce is because Rodolfo completed his PhD in history here at Georgetown and recently defended his thesis in January. His dissertation was on revolution and the industrial city, violence and capitalism in Monterrey, Mexico, 1890 to 1920. He's currently teaching at Brandeis University, and today he's going to be talking to us about revolutionary conflicts, contradictory outcomes, 1910 to 1920. So over to you, Rodolfo.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me. Thanks, it's great to be back in Georgetown. Though I think I haven't left for long enough time for you to start missing me, I guess. But it's great to be here, and it's particularly great to be able to talk about the Mexican Revolution. Today I want to start talking about a voyage of a U.S. military transport ship called the USAT Buford that traveled from Galveston, Texas to Veracruz in the early summer of 1915. This ship would, a few years later in 1919, become famous, or infamous, I guess, for being the ship that was used to deport a lot of socialists and anarchists from the United States, including Emma Goldman. She was. They were deported right after the Russian Revolution, which is kind of this ship's claim to fame. It was a U.S. military transport ship. In this case, the ship wasn't carrying a boatload of radicals. Mexico, I guess, had enough radicals in 1920. Didn't need to deport them. Although, I guess, are there enough radicals ever? Sorry. The mission of this vessel was to rescue some foreigners that were fearing for their life because they were living through some of the deadliest moments of the Mexican Revolution. Early 1915 was a period that's. I mean, we know now that that was the moment when most people lost their lives during the Mexican Revolution. Conditions in Mexico had deteriorated significantly in the last few months. Food was scarce, businesses were closed, unemployment was rampant, and disease was spreading throughout most metropolitan cities. The cargo bay of the ship was not empty, though. It was carrying 11 tons of beans aimed at relieving the near famine conditions This shipment caught the attention of the British consul who had organized the refugees' escape. When the ship arrived in Veracruz, the consul recognized these beans as a shipment of beans that had been exported just a few weeks earlier from Veracruz to Texas. The American Red Cross had actually purchased Mexican beans and reimported them back to Mexico. What explains this circuitous trip? And more importantly, what exactly was the impact of this commercial circuit at a moment when people were suffering? How were people's lives affected by it? Today, I want to offer a synthetic view of the 1910-1920 decade, focusing on the pivotal civil war of 1914 and 1915. During the first few months of 1915, no one knew who was going to be able to build a regime that could rule all over Mexico. Since the breakdown of the negotiations of the Convention of Aguascalientes in November of 1914, power was being contested by factions that represented different political economies. Power had been displaced from its traditional center and now resided in competing capitals. One of these capitals, one of these centers of power, was the port of Veracruz. This vision of Mexican politics that does not include Mexico City as the center of the country is not common, but it is necessary in order to understand the contradictory outcomes of the conflicts of 1910 to 1920. This perspective also helps illuminate the way that violence impacted people's lives, and perhaps even explain the differences between the idyllic countryside life represented in Golden Age movies like Allá en el Rancho Grande, and the darker themes of pre-Golden Age movies like Redes and others like Prisionero 13, etc., etc. So before I go into this, I want to start with a historical context. Many people have thought of the Mexican Revolution as a long, singular event that spans several decades. But most of us understand that what is usually referred to as the Mexican Revolution, with capital R, is in fact a series of conflicts that transformed Mexico from a liberal dictatorship headed by Porfirio Diaz to a populist regime, which we will talk about later. So as a way to synthesize this decade, I want to list some of these crucial moments in this process. So this all begins before 1910 with an international recession, an economic downturn caused in part by the panic of 1907 here in the United States. This is compounded by a series of droughts and natural disasters. The impact of droughts and famine as a cause of the Mexican Revolution has been studied, but there are other natural events that have not really been taken as seriously. For example, there's an earthquake in Guerrero in the early summer of 1909, which diverts a lot of federal aid. And there is also a flood in Monterrey in the late summer of 1909. There's actually two different floods in August that killed thousands of people. But it also had some specific political consequences. This flood and the slow reaction to it ended the political aspirations of Bernardo Reyes, who had been the main opposition figure within the Porfirian regime, but he had been the main opposition, or at least one of the possible successors. And him being displaced from power and being basically kind of eliminated from the presidential contention opened the door for Francisco Madero, who also resided in and around Monterrey, to rise to power and to open the doors to the revolution. And this kind of indicates to another thing that was going on before 1910, which is this political crisis, right? The political system was basically facing the issue of secession as dictatorships inevitably do, right? Reyes had been the front runner for the secession race, but had been opposed by several other members of the regime. When he was moved out of the way, and when Madero became the leader of the opposition, things changed, because although Madero was not a radical, Madero was at least not part of the regime. Of course, being an outsider, he was not given a fair chance in the elections, and this is one of the things that pushed Madero and the Maderistas to rebel. So this is basically another stage of these series of long processes that we call the Mexican Revolution, which is the Mexican, the Maderista insurrection and the presidency, 1910 to 1913. And of course, Madero comes into the presidency after the short insurrection with a lot of popularity. But this popularity is eroded relatively quickly because of opposition from different sides. People on his, former allies in the Partido Liberal, or even some more radical elements like the Magonistas, the Zapatistas, the Orozquistas, they all eventually oppose him openly. Also, the military and the political structures of the old regime that were not, dismantled, the army, the bureaucracy. And of course, as we know, this all culminates in February of 1915 with a coup against him in the descent of Africa. And this kind of opens a different stage of these processes, which begins with the coup and ends with what I actually do call the Mexican Revolution. Right? So once Madero loses his life, he's ousted from power. Victoriano Huerta becomes president, becomes a military dictator, and this, of course, unites all of the opposition against him. Nothing that unites as a dictator. Former reyistas like Venustiano Carranza, some federal officers like Felipe Ángeles, other less mainstream groups like the Zapatistas, and of course the remnants of the Maderista movement, they all come together, they form the Constitutional Autonomy, and they eventually are able to displace Victoriano Huerta, in part thanks to also the U.S. invading the port of Veracruz, of course. So I think this is the moment, if anything can be called a revolution with a capital R, it would be this moment, the singular moment in Teoloyucan, just outside Mexico City in August 13th of 1914, when the federal army surrenders to the revolutionary army. But even this is not in itself the revolution, or the totality of the revolution. This is just a moment, because as often happens with revolutions, the really difficult period comes afterwards, right? It comes when the surviving regime has to find a way to build. When the revolutionary army has to find a way to build a regime based on this, right? So this is the bloodiest period of the war. This is the moment when most people, when people experience the worst outcomes in terms of health and safety. This is also not a moment that's studied as much as the previous moment, right? When everybody was united against Huerta, this is the moment when people are writing corridos, people are writing La Cucaracha, about Huerta. Huerta is La Cucaracha. He's this horrible person who can't move without smoking a joint or something. I mean, that's what the song is about, right? And this is a unifying moment. But the period, the period that follows has not captured the imagination of as many people. It's not as studied because it's a more confusing moment. But it is the moment that a lot of people will remember. People who lived through this will remember these moments when there wasn't enough food, when there wasn't enough employment, when there was disease rampant in the cities. So this is, by the way, though, one more thing is that this moment is not completely, I guess, inevitable, right? There were many ways in which this war could have been averted. It's just something that we have to keep in mind, I guess. So there's different factions representing different political economies, different geographic bases, or what, for the purposes of this paper, I'm going to call different capitals competing for power, right? When they come together as the convention of Aguascalientes, there's the Zapatistas. They joined the convention a little bit late, but they really make their mark in the convention. The Zapatistas are the classic, very revolutionaries. They're what we usually think of when we think of a Mexican revolutionary: big hats, rifle, They were based. Their capital could have been Cuautla, but they were actually based on ecologically autonomous communities, as John would call them, of South Central Mexico, in the highlands of Morelos, especially. They were basically able to live off the land. They were, they had close links to the community, and this made them almost invincible. It made it very difficult to defeat them because they could just go back into the Sierra when the army came, and then come back and do these types of irregular attacks. But this also meant that they had very limited offensive capacity. As opposed to, for example, the Villistas in the north. Villa's army, they're often thought of as being very similar to the Zapatistas, or being kind of like the northern version of the Zapatistas. But they were in fact pretty different. Many of them were cowboys, they were rancheros. They either worked in ranches, or they had a small plots of land that they worked with their families. But many others were also workers. Many of them worked in mines. Many of them worked in the cotton haciendas. Many of them worked seasonally in the cotton haciendas, and at other points they worked in cotton factories. So many of these people were living in both urban industrial settings and in more agricultural-based economies. They lived close to the railroad because they traveled from between the mines and the cities and the haciendas. So railroads were central to the Villista strategy. They were centered around Torreon. You can see Torreon kind of as a capital, but it was really the railroad that the Villistas knew how to exploit. Of course, this meant that this army was not ecologically autonomous. They could not live off the land. They had to find ways to provide for the army. They had to find weapons. They had to find supplies. They had to find energy sources for the railroads, and also for some of the industry. So they basically depended on the export economy. Now, Mexico's export economy was the main economic engine of Mexico at the time. In fact, it was the main economic engine of most of the world. Remember, we are living in a period of, this is a period of economic liberalism. World economies have been specializing since the second half of the 19th century. So many rich countries, many rich areas have industrialized, and most other countries have basically specialized in exporting raw materials. These raw materials were, the cattle, the agricultural goods, the mineral ore that was being extracted from the mines, and most of it being shipped to the United States. So this was like the political economy of the Villistas was based on the dominant economic model of Mexico. This was basically the present. While the Zapatistas were trying to protect the traditional communities, they were, as Womack famously puts it, they went to a revolution because they did not want to change. They were defending the past. The Villistas are planted firmly in the present of the Mexican economy. But not all of the raw material, the ore, the cotton that was being produced in these borderlands where the Villistas came from went to the United States. Some of them went to other parts of Mexico. This is the third political economy that's competing for power during this moment. And these are the capital here, I would say, is the city of Monterrey. Maderistas usually fade away from history after President Madero is killed, and his brother Gustavo is killed in February of 1913. But one of the most important discoveries that I did while I was going through my research for my dissertation was that the Maderistas kept on. There was still a strong Maderista movement that went back to Monterrey that tried to reignite the economy of Monterrey. Other members of the Madero family, particularly the younger brother Raúl, but also cousins, friends, allies of the Madero family, like Felipe Ángeles in particular. But also, Villa considered himself a Maderista always. Of course, later he became bigger than life, and he, I guess, became a Villista, right? But before, Villa was a Villista, and throughout his life, he always considered himself to be a Maderista. But of course, their capital being based in Monterrey, they need coal, they need oil to reignite the economy of Monterrey, and this is what they're not able to do. Because these three different factions, these three different political economies are basically working with each other. They're trying to build a government. And of course, they all have different interests, they have different social bases, but this is what government does, right? I mean, you try to conciliate different economic interests, different political perspectives. There's another faction that is not part of the alliance. Carranza continues to with the constitutionalist army. Carranza, like the villistas, also came from the borderlands of northern Mexico. Carranza was from Cuatro Ciénegas in the borderlands of Coahuila, places that faced the brunt of the expanding Comanche Empire in the 19th century, the Lipan Apaches. Many of his lieutenants were also from the same region, either from Monclova or from Lampazos in Monterrey. These are all towns that are just a few miles away from each other, that are kind of the center of this northern borderlands. When the Convention of Aguascalientes breaks up, Carranza is in Mexico City. So he's basically far away from his capital. While Zapata is firmly entrenched in Morelos, Villa controls the railroad and controls the access to Torreon, which is his capital. The Maderistas head to Monterrey. They take it by January 1st of 1915. They are in control of Monterrey. Venustiano Carranza is stranded in Mexico City. Ironically, he is holding the capital, but this capital, Mexico City, is completely useless. Carranza just leaves Mexico City even before the convention actually breaks down. The convention breaks down officially around November 10th. Carranza is out of Mexico City by the first week of November. And he goes down to Puebla, and he doesn't know what to do. He can maybe go up to the Sierra of Oaxaca and try to defend like the Zapatistas, but this is not something that Carranza is interested in. He's not interested in being a guerrillero. He's not interested in being away from the export economy that he knows so well. So he sends his brother to Oaxaca, to Salina Cruz, to one of the most important ports in the Gulf Coast. Jesus Carranza goes there. He tries to negotiate with the local leaders, and Jesus Carranza is actually killed trying to secure Salina Cruz for the constitutionalists. He sends Pablo Gonzalez, who's his closest collaborator. He's from Lampazos, Nuevo León, which is right next to Cuatro Ciénegas. He sends him with most of their army, 20,000 men, to Tampico. They have to cross through San Luis. They have to cross through the Huasteca Potosina. Out of the 20,000 men that leave Tlaxcala, only about 3,000 men actually arrive in Tampico. So they're afraid that they're also going to lose Tampico. But Tampico is crucial to them, and I'll come back to that in a second. Finally, he sends his son-in-law to Veracruz to negotiate with the U.S. that's leaving Veracruz. The U.S. is not sure that they want to leave Veracruz to the Carrancistas. They actually wait a week to see if the villistas are able to come down, but the villistas are nowhere to be seen because they moved to the north to defend the north. And the U.S. leaves, and Carranza takes over the city. This is the moment when Álvaro Obregón, who later becomes crucial in this, kind of joins the alliance of the Carrancistas. So now Carranza is faced with the port, which brings in a lot of money, with a lot of weapons and supplies that he finds in the port that the U.S. left behind, but he doesn't have enough men. The villistas, on the other hand, they have a lot of men because they're very popular, but they don't have enough weapons. So they're in these completely different positions. What the villistas do is that whenever they take a city, they distribute the corn, they try to expropriate as much money as they can from the elites to give back to the people so the people will join the movement. The Carrancistas do the opposite. The Carrancistas try to take the corn, try to take the food, try to isolate the cities. And hence, this explains why that circuit of corn that Buford was following. The Carrancistas isolate the cities because this becomes a very convenient way for them to create more unrest in the city, and the people will leave the city, and they will be conscripted into the Carrancista army. So they have the weapons, and now they have a a lot of disgruntled people who want to join their army. The villistas or the conventionalists are not able to reignite the economy of Monterrey because although they take over the coal mining region, which is just north of Cuatro Ciénegas and La Pasos, they are not able to take Tampico. So this is the battle of Ébano, when the Carrancistas stop the Villista advance in Tampico. That actually defeats Villa. Everybody later, talks about the Battle of Celaya being the crucial battle, but it was actually when they were stopped in Ébano that they lost the war in 1915. So this basically kind of explains a little bit what the situation was in Veracruz, around Veracruz, during 1915. There were horrible conditions, near-famine conditions, and this was basically manufactured by the Carrancistas in many ways. This was a recruitment strategy. So when we see these early movies, these pre-Golden Age movies that are placing so much emphasis on the violence created and on the stress exerted on families, this is kind of what's in people's minds when they're thinking of the Mexican Revolution. It's these periods, right? The Carrancistas are able to win the war, though, and eventually, the narrative changes. And also, but the Carrancistas also win the war by basically destroying the Mexican economy. Generation there into the 1930s, people were still paying with silver because they didn't trust, paper money because of the inflation. And ironically, Monterrey was able to recover thanks to shipments of corn, and Monterrey eventually became the center of opposition to the emerging regime. A right-wing opposition, but still the only opposition to the U.S. regime. So this is kind of my synthesis of
Thank you very much, Rodolfo. If you have questions, if you want to jot them down, make a note of them. We're going to take all of the papers, and then we're going to have a very rich discussion, I'm sure, afterwards. So now I'm going to introduce someone who absolutely doesn't need any introduction. This is Professor John Tutino is going to speak now. He's Professor of History and International Affairs here at Georgetown, and he's also the Director of the Americas Initiative. He's the author of From Insurrection to Revolution in Mexico, Social Bases of Agrarian Violence, 1750 to 1940, and Making a New World, Founding Capitalism in the Bajío and Spanish North America, published in 2011, which has already received great acclaim. He's co-editor with Elisa Serrín and Leticia Reina of Cycles of Conflict, Centuries of Change, Crisis Reform and Revolution in Mexico in 2007, and also editor of Mexico Mexicans in the Making of the United States, which is a volume published out of an Americas Initiative event. So that gives you some insight into John's tremendous range. Today he's going to be talking to us about can a regime be a revolution? Mexico 1920 to 1940. So over to you, John.
Thank you, Sarah. And my aim here is to try to be a brief pivot between all of that complex conflict of 1910 to 1920 and Heather Fowler's focused discussion taking us to Veracruz in the 1920 to 40 era, which is the domain in which Redes was finally filmed. And I wanted to do this by asking this question: can a regime be a revolution? Rodolfo talked about the Mexican Revolution with a capital. And I want to suggest it never had a capital letter while it was before 1920. That instead, it was when the government that took power in the 1920s decided to construct itself and assert a regime consolidating power was the Mexican Revolution, capital up. And it's something to think about, I'd like to suggest. I much prefer thinking about revolutions with a plural, revolutions, and without capital letters, because they're complex, as you've just heard. And I want to quickly say that what happened in Mexico between 1910 and 1920, by any definition, was a revolution. Everything, state, economy, society, culture, was contested, was in play, and for large periods of time during that decade, no regime began to pretend to rule most of Mexico. There might have been a government in Mexico City, there might have been another government somewhere else, but actually a government rule in Mexico is just not there. So it seems to me, by any definition, revolution is going on. As you just heard, and again I'm going to run by this, there are so many factions in play. And I want to suggest that two factions had large popular bases. The Zapatistas, agrarian villages, via northern cowboys, miners, workers. And there were also factions of what I want to call elite reformers, who mixed all kinds of interest regions, etc. And those multiple factions, as you heard, are constantly in diverse alliances and conflicts. There's no moment in which there are clear, this is who's for what, this is who's with whom, this is whom against whom. It's in constant flux. And what I want to pick up with is somewhere between 1950, 1917, 1920, the constitutionalists win. And they win, and they assert a democratic rhetoric, and I will politely say some authoritarian tendencies. They assert radical programs, labor rights, agrarian reform, etc., and they orchestrated the killings of Zapata and Villa, the representatives of the popular movements whose programs they later adopted. They became, particularly in the 20s, pro-labor. And I've always asked why. And while I was putting together the notes to this talk, it suddenly dawned on me, thinking in the reflection of Rodolfo's, maybe they were pro-labor because they were so anti-industrial Monterrey. And that's one way to edge at your industrial opponents in Monterrey, which would be to take a pro-labor stance. In 1920s Mexico, there is a radicalism in being pro-labor, but labor is a very small sector of Mexico at that moment in time. They are also loudly, persistently, and I think here I can say, and at heart, anti-clerical. And this is a central part of what the constitutionalists are. And I will say, the outcome, particularly of the latter, is that this is not a national unity agenda. To take as your loudest public radicalism, anti-clericalism, in a society that is deeply Catholic, is, without saying a word about right, wrong, visions of future, etc., it is divisive, if to say nothing else, in that point in time. During the 20s, this group, and I'm not going to go into right here a period of Obregon's presidency, Calle's presidency, and then what we call the Maximato, in which Obregon has been elected president, is assassinated before he takes office, and in which Calle continues to hold power in the background while a series of other folks exercise and rule as president. But we're also starting to learn that they weren't all just purely Calle's puppets. They have some power and some ability to shape the agenda going on. But during the 20s, the regime is able to carry on in large part because there is still an export boom. And as Rodolfo has said, Mexico is still an export economy. And with something of an export boom in the 20s, there are earnings they can move forward. They mobilize labor support, and it is an important part of the regime. And this is a government that, to characterize very complex things that Heather knows way more about than I do, particularly for Veracruz, the central regime itself is not radically pro-agrarian reform, but it's constantly being challenged by the right, by landlords, by the Cristero rebellion in Jalisco, And they're constantly needing to mobilize rural support to fight their opponents, and they keep returning to do agrarian reform, which I believe they fundamentally oppose, in order to mobilize supporters to fight their opponents. I can't think of a more entrenched contradiction than to be having to mobilize those who are in favor of what you oppose in order to stay in power. And they carry on through the 20s. And then the Depression comes. And I want to say we don't think enough about the impact of the Depression on Mexico. But suddenly, the export economy that has been everything to Mexico with the Depression just collapses. It's gone. The earnings, the production, the labor they had had is largely over. Now, there is a sudden revelation that we need industry. And what is the most industrially developed place in Mexico? The Monterrey that we have crushed in order to win the revolution, whose elites have gone into opposition there. And so, again, a contradiction. The regime needs to mobilize an industrialization that is largely led by Monterrey, while Monterrey elites oppose the regime. But what does develop is what I want to call the classic populist alliance, in which the regime favors industrialization for internal markets and tries to balance that with the favoring of labor rights in order to move into a more industrial, less export-oriented, less labor development. Along the way, I will say the collapse of the export economy in the Depression also makes agrarian reform easier. Suddenly the large landowners are not so powerful. They're not so politically placed, they're not so rich, so that you can move forward on your land reform a little more easily. Meanwhile, into the 30s, the regime maintains its vehement anti-clericalism. And recent studies have shown that for all, the president of Mexico, Lázaro Cárdenas, who really takes office just as red as is being made in late 34, he is the closest thing to a national unity president Mexico probably has in the 20th century. Yet recent studies have now documented that he kept an edge of anti-clericalism that seriously inhibited his ability to implement his own educational land and other reforms across rural Mexico, because while he was offering programs that people actually wanted, he was tying it to an anti-clericalism that alienated many of the people and communities he's trying to benefit and recruit. All the while, a growing community of international radicals see Mexico as a new model for liberation. It is a model that in the 30s is clearly in opposition to fascism, supports the Republican Spanish Civil War, receives so many of the refugees from the Spanish Civil War. And while this revolution has a rhetoric of socialism, it calls its education socialist education, it is not tied to Stalin, Soviet communism, but is an independent voice, and in fact always remains a dedicated capitalist society, despite some rhetoric in the era of revolution. And in this context, people came from all over the world, the US, Europe, but we're discovering from India, from Japan, from Asia, come to Mexico because they see a model of liberation that is grounded in the people and that is different from the contentious developments in Europe at the time, where fascism versus socialism is really coming toward a head. This moment, in fact, to do an ad for a friend's book, the wonderful Mexican historian Mauricio Tenorio Trio has just written a book called I Speak of the City. It looks at Mexico City at times in comparison with Washington, D.C. in the 20s and 30s. And what he shows is these international liberation-oriented radicals coming to Mexico City, seeking an alternative utopia. And they concentrate in Mexico City. And he concludes with two challenging comments. The international radicals came to Mexico City and could not ever see the city they lived in with all its urban challenges and its urban culture. And they imagined a pristine rural Mexico. The rural Mexico that had been, shall I say, crushed in the constitutional defeat of the Zapatistas. But as Tenorio points out, it's not even anything to do with that. They'd never been there in most cases. They didn't visit it, they didn't know it. But in their writings, they imagined a pristine rural Mexico as a model for the world. A Zapatista Mexico, if you will. And I'm going to just conclude these remarks by saying Redes, as a film, was produced in that crucible. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. So now we're going to move on to our next speaker, Heather Fowler-Mooney, who's Professor Emerita of History at Bradley University. And she's author of Agrarian Radicalism in Veracruz, 1920 to 1938, and Working Women, Entrepreneurs and the Mexican Revolution, the Coffee Culture of Córdoba, Veracruz. That's a recent publication just last year. And she's also co-editor with Mary Kay Vaughan of Women in the Mexican Countryside, 1850 to 1990, Creating Spaces Shaping Transition. And today she'll be speaking to us, as indicated, about Veracruz, and the title of her paper, Rethinking Post-Revolutionary Veracruz, Society and Politics, 1920 to 1940.
Thank you. I think that my role this afternoon is sort of trying to contextualize Redes in terms of the location where it was filmed, which was Veracruz, its history and its politics. And so I want to begin with three questions that I want to try to answer in my own way without being a film expert by any stretch of the imagination. The first question that I'd like to think about is what was unique about the Veracruz revolutionary and post-revolutionary experience, and how it related to Redes, which was filmed there. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about the factors that might have led the makers of the film to film in Alvarado. And I want to talk a little bit about Alvarado. And then thirdly, I want to come back to the center, which we've been talking about the center already, and the role of the Mexican state in 1934-35 in the making of this film. Okay, so what was unique about Veracruz? I'm not sure it was all that unique, but anyway, it did have a revolutionary experience and a post-revolutionary experience that the Veracruzanos think was unique, of course. I didn't bring a big map with me, but Veracruz is sort of a banana-like shape that goes along the whole coast of the Gulf of Mexico. And there's a northern section, and there's a central section and a southern section that are all different. But essentially it is turned towards the Gulf, and it is very much influenced by actually the Caribbean culture that sometimes we forget. It's also a state that is pretty far away from the Altiplano. It's pretty far away from Mexico City. So Mexico City cannot exert the same amount of political and economic and ecclesiastical control over the state. And so many of the things that happen there are not so tied to central politics. I want to go back to some comments that Rodolfo made. The most important city in Veracruz is the port of Veracruz, right in the center of the banana. If you want to say, look at it that way. And it's the most important, not only the most important city for the state, it's the most important port for the nation. It's the center of railroad traffic into the interior. So everything passed through the port of Veracruz. Not only things that were exported and things that were imported, but immigrants, foreign exiles that he talked about, slaves. And so it was, this whole area of central Veracruz was influenced by what happened in the port of Veracruz. And of course there were all sorts of invasions through the port of Veracruz. The Spaniards invaded through the port of Veracruz, the French and the Americans. So this is a rather important central region, and Alvarado is just 40 miles south of that. And so, and with the railroad that went down there. So that in itself is important. I think it's also important to say something about the population and the ethnicity of the population of the Sotavento, which was brought out earlier, but I'd like to reiterate it. The Sotavento Veracruzano has been influenced by the importation of slaves. And therefore, in the flyer that was presented, I guess it's all around campus, there was a picture of Afro-Mexicans. And this area is particularly known from Veracruz south to the Patalalpan River as the Sotavento, and with a very Afro-Mexican environment. And I want to just mention that because that does come out in the music, although it does not come out in the film. We might talk about that. All right. So what makes Veracruz revolutionary history a little distinct from, let's say, Monterrey? Quite different. All right. First of all, a major armed rebellion did not occur in Veracruz. In other words, it happened in Morelos, down where Zapata was, or it happened in the north, in Chihuahua, and Sonora, because Veracruz was actually a very wealthy state in 1910. It had developed very sophisticated modern textile industry. And it had a vibrant commercial agricultural economy with guanabanas, which you've heard about, mangoes and papayas and all sorts of good fruit and things like that. And so, in general, the population was not as oppressed. And therefore, the level of revolutionary activity in Veracruz was not on the same scale as you would find in other parts of Mexico. However, it did have two different forms of revolutionary activity. The first kind I would call an urban social protest movement, or movements. These were workers' movements, primarily in the industrial towns of Orizaba and the Valley of Orizaba, in Veracruz and in Jalapa, where workers, influenced by anarcho-syndicalist exiles and ideas, organized and began in 1906 to agitate for essentially better working conditions and higher wages. Very, very basic economic desires. But when the regime clamped down on them, or refused, and the industry refused to listen to their very moderate demands, this led to confrontations, mostly caused by the jefes políticos and the industry themselves. So that was one kind of urban protest that continued all the way up to the 1940s, one can say, but it really started in the early 1950s. There were also rural rebellions, scattered rural rebellions throughout Veracruz. And they were primarily led by rancheros, by middle-class farmers who were fed up with corrupt municipal officials and wanted to become involved in the Maderista political movement, and they took up arms essentially for limited political goals, essentially to insert themselves into politics. Now, both of these movements were very successful at the beginning during the Maderista Revolution. They took over municipal governments, but they really couldn't go much further than that. And it was really not until Carranza and his armies invaded Veracruz in 1914 after El Ébano that the whole political structure changed in Veracruz. So one has to, in a sense, say that revolution to Veracruz only came about through an invasion from without. Then the second period of the revolution and the post-revolutionary period is really was orchestrated by the state, by a post-revolutionary state. When Candido Aguilar assumed office in 1914, and then two other governors assumed office in Veracruz, they were able to control Veracruz for until 1933, so for 19 years. And during this period, these three progressive reformist governors instituted a tremendous amount of radical agrarian reform programs, labor reforms, anti-clerical reforms, and tenant reforms that reshaped primarily the cities and to a lesser extent the rural areas, although agrarian reform did take place there progressively. And these laws, if you go and read these laws, these Veracruz laws, were actually so much more progressive than in almost all states in Mexico. And if you want to compare it, let's say, with the New Deal, they were way out in front. The New Deal is way back there. So all of this, however, sort of came to an end in 1933 when Tejeda left office. And so my question is, well, if Veracruz was a model for a revolution, why did the makers of redes come to Veracruz? Maybe we need to look a little further. Maybe there's something more here. So the second question that I wanted to sort of address was the whole questions of why they came and why they chose the city or the town of Alvarado. What is it about Alvarado that is special? And there are certain things that are special about Alvarado, but maybe they're not the things that you would think would be special. Alvarado was originally a pre-Hispanic fishing village on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico that was discovered by Pedro Alvarado, the notorious lieutenant of Cortez. Does not have a very good reputation in Mexican history. And he named the town after himself. Okay? And the river too, the Papaloapan River was actually named after him too. So that's the way it started. Now this town, the most important thing about this town is its location. It's located on a peninsula that extends south, 40 miles south of the port of Veracruz. And on one side is the Gulf, with beautiful, pristine beaches, which you will see in redes. And on the other side of the peninsula is an enormous lagoon into which the Papaloapan River flows and a few other rivers. So it is an extraordinarily picturesque village or town. And in the movie, you see both sides. In fact, there's some beautiful scenes taken from the lagoon side, and if you go on the internet, that's what you'll see too. You'll see almost the same pictures on the internet of the town of Alvarado that you will see in the film, if they show that particular episode today. So what I'm suggesting is that one of the main reasons that they chose Alvarado was because of its scenery, because of its picturesqueness. It's also such a small town, or was such a small town there, that the countryside was right there. And so they could find these beautiful little straw huts that the fishermen lived in. And so you have the ideal countryside represented in these little straw huts, and these fishermen are really descended of peasants. And the fishermen have really replaced the peasants in this particular movie. And that's important. We might talk about how the fisherman or the peasant is represented in this movie. The other thing that's important about this town is that it is a port and a small commercial site because all the cattle and coffee and cotton and sugar that came down the Papalapan River would have to be transported in riverboats. And they actually show one of the riverboats where they're loading something onto the riverboat to take up. So all the ingredients for sort of this perfect, pristine riverboat town are found there in Alvarado. Now, but there's one strange thing here, that the town of Alvarado is never mentioned. So if you look at this movie and you don't get to the credits, and you're not Veracruzano or a Jarocho, you wouldn't know where this picture took place. You would have no clue. So we have to then ask ourselves, why did the makers of this film go to Alvarado, Veracruz, besides for the scenery, to make this film? And so now, John was saying, why did I invite her to come and talk about Veracruz if she's not going to talk about Veracruz? Because I'm not going to talk about Veracruz. I'm going to talk about
Veracruz.
I know, really Veracruz. So I went to. So I'm going to give you sort of these are my theories, okay? So why was the Mexican state interested in making this film in Alvarado in 1934 and 1935? Well, in 1934, a group of Sonoran generals had been ruling Veracruz for, I guess we could say, since 1920. And they created a very authoritarian government that became more and more authoritarian and less revolutionary. And there was more and more discontent in the countryside. And this is why when Lázaro Cárdenas becomes president, he begins to change things a little bit. But there was one ministry in the Mexican state that was way out in front of everybody else, and that was the Ministry of Education. And the Ministry of Education, of Public Education, which is called the SEP, had, since the early 1920s, had a series of ministers who were interested in organizing the countryside, organizing and spreading the gospel of revolution, and instilling a sort of a national revolutionary culture throughout Mexico that also actually reverberated throughout the world and reverberated in the United States for that matter. And so they organized educators, artists, muralists, musicians, filmmakers, to sort of reconfigure and to modernize attitudes towards Mexico and the Mexican mentality. And they did this not only within the classroom, but also within the school, outside of the buildings, by films, etc. And so we have to see this as part of this. In other words, Narciso Bassos, who was Minister of Education in 1932 and 1933, who was a very progressive educator, who probably filmed it, well, he must have filmed this or funded this film had certain ideas in mind, and he wanted to do something with this film that was had to do with, I would say, popular culture, with revolutionary culture, and not so much about Veracruz. So, what I'm going to suggest is this is my theory, without having read anything about this film. Essentially what they're trying to do with this film is to show an ordinary town, very picturesque, ordinary town, and with ordinary people, everyday people, who are being terribly exploited every day. They are also using very traditional social roles. You see this in the film. In other words, you see the local boss, the cacique, who dominates the town. He dominates the fishermen. They can't do anything without him. He dominates politics. He controls the politician. He dominates the police force. This almost sounds like pre-revolutionary Mexico, doesn't it? You also have the exploited masses. The fishermen are the exploited masses. They're not this time. They're not peasants, but they're fishermen. And the cinematography of the fishermen and the way they do the fishing and the fish and the nets is just spectacular. But it really is about peasants. And then it also has very traditional gender roles. If you look at the gender roles, the men are the primary breadwinners. They are going out to catch the fish. They are macho. There are all sorts of jokes about macho jokes about catching women in nets and things like that. And there's only one woman who you will see who is the long-suffering mother, wife. The only woman. So, what is this all about? Well, I would argue that this film is really about the exploited, the continuation of exploitation in the countryside in the 1930s, and also popular resistance. In other words, these fishermen are going to fight for their popular, for their justice for the pay, right? Okay. So I would suggest that the makers of this film are really saying to the viewer that the social revolution, the Mexican Revolution, has not really succeeded by 1934 or 35 completely. And maybe they need some more help. Maybe they need some more films to understand what still needs to be addressed. Or, I would like to say sort of in conclusion that Redes is trying to challenge us to rethink the meaning of revolution in general, and the cultural revolution in particular, and how they are interrelated. And what that means is that understanding revolution today in Mexico also might help us in understanding what is going on in Egypt, or Ukraine, or Venezuela today. Thank you.
To all our speakers. I think they've done a very convincing job of suggesting that revolutions is what we should be talking about, and the diversity of revolutionary experience. I'd like to open up the floor now for any questions or comments that you might like to tell me about our speakers.
I'm always fascinated by a film against the government that is financed by the government. How do you explain that?
Well, that's why I was explaining that actually and I'm not an authority on the set, but essentially they were going out on a limb and proceeding in an entirely different trajectory than what Calles and other Sonoran generals were doing. There is this contradiction. You're absolutely right. There's no doubt about that.
Subversive filmmakers take the money from the government make the film you want to make?
I think it might also have something to do with the perfectionism that we talked about in the revolution itself, and as it continues over time. The revolutions at cross purposes sometimes. Some parts of the government are actually more revolutionary than others, and the set is where all the radicals had landed right at this point in time. But I have a simple question. I have a chance to talk later, so I will. But the simple question is, at what day does Cárdenas come to power? My assumption was that the elections are in July, because the film is actually made shot very quickly, beginning in January of 1934, and they're done by November of 1934.
So he is not yet president.
So it's
inaugurated
really this
December
very,
1st.
it's the really corrupt period immediately prior to
And it's the classic lame duck.
Right.
Calles is hanging on. Calles has sanctioned the election of Cárdenas, but very reluctantly.
And it was actually Abelardo Rodriguez, or was it?
Yeah, I think Rodriguez is still in power, and Calles is dreaming that Cárdenas will be one more puppet, and Cárdenas is plotting to free himself, to actually oust Calles, which actually takes him a full year after he's president. So all of this uncertainty is in play, but it makes it a classic intermediary lame duck period. But I think the key is Cárdenas is not president. This reflects all of this tension within the government and generally before Cárdenas puts his stamp on the government.
So how was the film received in Mexico? Was it received as subversive?
I don't think any of us are here to answer that question. That may be Jim better to answer that.
You'll have to stay for the whole afternoon to find out.
Great. Yeah, we're not ready to.
John, would you elaborate a little bit on your concluding comment about sort of understanding Reyes as a vision of a pristine rural Mexico, and does that connect to Heather's argument about the film's play with particularity, but also universality?
Yeah,
in
well,
terms of play?
first thing I'm going to say is we didn't talk anything about our content. But mine really came from in the middle of the process in which Angel and Joe invited me into this. I saw Reyes for the first time. I invited Heather. Lands on my desk late last spring, this new book by Mauricio Tenorio. And he is a Mexican. He teaches at the University of Chicago. He's a wonderful scholar, in my humble opinion. And he is studying this larger community of intellectual, radical, rebel world shakers in Mexico City. And I really I was struck by that, by his conclusion. And his conclusion, because his book is actually focused on the city, that all of these radicals came and they lived 90% of the time in Mexico City. They did not get out of the city. Yet if you read all the things they wrote about Mexico, some of the classic cases, Anita Brenner's, the woman swept next door, idle behind altars, they're creating an image of a pristine rural Mexico that they've never met, right? And so I want to raise the question. As Heather has said, the filmmakers who went to Alvarado and they found this wonderful scenery and scene, right? But they have Mexico, overwhelmingly non-urban Mexico are cultivated villagers. I think that's a fair comment. Fishing has always been there, but it's not the core of what Mexico and its rural, non-urban self has been. They have gone here and they've created, I'm reading my seeing the film against Tenorio's comment, that they have, and against Heather's comment, that they have reconstructed the rural village as a fishing village, as a didactic utopia. And I think there's nothing wrong with a filmmaker seeking to create a didactic utopia. I would guess that's what filmmakers want to do, right? But what Tenorio would say, probably, is that this isn't, certainly not an approximation of the challenges of living in the barrios of Mexico City in 1934 and 1935. though political bossism is there too, in a much dingier environment, we will lose that. Nor would he suggest that this reflects the real complexities of, say, post-Zapata Morelos, where you have agrarian reform and political bossism and just a whole other set of conflicts. And I guess at this point I want to add, I know we have some folks who were with us last Saturday when we did Viva Zapata, Steinbeck's vision, Brando's portrayal, etc. And clearly, Viva Zapata's Mexico is strikingly different from Rede's Mexico, except they're both rural and revolutionary in this. But I want to pick up on a couple of things Heather has commented. The Alvarado region is famously Afro-Mexican. And there isn't a lot of that evident in the filming. There's one. I'm going to ask, does anybody other than me catch the one bit of reflection? Not everybody's seen it, but there are a bunch of you who have.
No.
Anybody recall the name of the foreman? Bingo. Mandingo. Somebody cutely gave an African name or an African resonant name to the evil foreman. But in fact, the Afro-Mexicans are the workers, are the fisher folk. Now, they may also be the foreman in this environment. And I want to resonate again. However one debates the differential portrayals, women are everywhere in Viva Zapata. And they are there in diverse roles, from the pummeled to the curandera to etc. And women are scarce and in a very traditional role in Rede's. Now, whether that is a reflection of making films in the 30s and making films in the 50s, I don't know. But there are a lot of things worth thinking about. That's all I would say.
Can I comment one more thing on Bernie's point about the idyllic? It's a different form of idyllic village life that we see in Reddit than what we see in Golden Age cinema. It's not the Allá en Rancho Grande rancheros being happy and heartbroken and singing, right? It's very much a vision of traditional life embedded in a more cosmopolitan, high modernism, I guess, would be a way to call it, right? Because it's and even when you see, I mean, that scene where they're throwing the nets, and it looks so mechanical. You know, it's more of a it's more of this interwar high modernism that has this very complicated relationship with technology and with nature. So it's more of a I mean, you know, I guess my point is that we have to see this within the broader cosmopolitan aesthetic, which is it's a very different type of idealized version of village life, I guess.
Oh, well, okay. This comment's going to come out of left field, but when we undertook the project of turning Grades into a DVD for Noxos, it's part of a tetralogy. And here's another context in which to look at Grades: the Plow the Broken Plains, the river, and the city. I wonder if anybody in the room is knowledgeable about the possible relationship between these four films. It occurred to me instantly because of two things: that Paul Strand is one of the cinematographers for the Plow the Broken Plains, because Aaron Copland reviewed Grades in the New York Times. Copland being the composer for the city, and of course, well, I don't know how much knowledge there is in the room. The first two films I mentioned, The Plow the Broken Plains and The River, are the product of a New Deal federal film project that was then terminated by Congress because of the content of these films, which are and are not subversive. I mean, they broach the same question that Notco asked 20 minutes ago. Are those films subversive? Is this film subversive? And it so happens that the city begins with an idealized portrayal of the village. That's from Louis Mumford, who of course is a historian of the city, on the left. So these are all films made in the 30s, during the Depression, on the left, making political statements that both fall within and without the precincts of the presiding government, whatever it might be. And my instinct instantly was to present the Genoxus as a tetralogy, which is how they're going to be presented on DVD. I'm just wondering if there are any further thoughts, if there's any additional knowledge about how these 4 films form a sequence.
I think there's some direct links that are very clear. So Strand worked on Redis and then went back to New York and founded something called Frontier Films, which made or was involved in Land and a few other films. And I think there was some involvement with the plow that broke.
He was one of the cinematography.
So there's some really explicit direct links between the films, but I think the deeper connection is that New York City and Mexico City were places where artists, intellectuals, visual artists and performance artists were going back and forth in kind of a little strong community. So quite a few people, Copeland was friends with Carlos Chavez, who was friends with Paul Strand.
And so we know if Herba Menz was influenced by directors.
I don't know if there's a direct link. I know it was shown in New York. It was released in the States in '37. And it was shown in New York. So
But to me, the essential difference between these films is that whereas in these Nubian films, the government is putting the money, like you say, we had a wonderful specialist that led us in creating these films, is we were happy, we were not against nature, we coexisted with nature, we destroyed nature, but we, the government, have the solution. This is the sequence of both the plowing of the plains, the river, and the sea. In Redes, there is no solution. The government is not proposing any solution.
Right.
And I think this is essential, and this is really what makes the difference.
It's a profound difference. The other 3
So this is why I wonder how the government can put money into something where there is no solution to the problem.
I disagree. I think Redis, and I wish everybody could. Hopefully this will lead everybody to go see Redis. I saw Redis as offering a solution, but you're right. The solution is not the government. It's not the state. And I would love to say it's the people, but no, it's men rowing together for a common goal.
Yes.
Will solve the problem.
Yes.
But at the same time, John, it's a much less finished film with a
No.
much less finished message.
But I think the message at the end is clear, and I think it fits that moment of transition in Mexico, where the government has been trying to do everything.
Mm-hmm.
And if the transition to Cárdenas is slow, and he's not as perfect and pure as he's sometimes been portrayed, but he amazingly opened up the regime to popular influence. Sometimes reality, sometimes in rhetoric. So there was a once-a-week audience. You could literally, or if you were Mexican, you could go to Los Pinos, you could go to the White House, and he held walk-in audiences for your problems. And he had staff people who said, you got a problem, here, take this, go back to the Jefe. And this is a developing, and it's part of, I would argue, that the government, as government reformer, worked okay in Mexico before the Depression, before the old economy collapsed. And now in the early 30s, they're really grasping. And Cárdenas' solution is to turn back to the base. And I don't know if there's any interplay between this emerging, what I want to call Cardenista vision of the new Mexico, and this being filmed during the period of his campaigning, election, and lame duck. But there sure is, to me, a parallel.
Okay, well, does Reyes imply that the government will be the agent of reform?
No, I'm saying, no. In fact, if the politician in Redes is
Because the other
basically
3
sold
films
out.
are very much about the empowering government.
Yep.
Government
It's about that.
It's a naive notion.
Right.
Propaganda.
But it's very explicit that government is the agent of social and political.
Right. And that's not.
And that's not.
That's not in red. I don't see it.
No.
Something that I think,
So, go ahead.
something that I think is really striking to me is that exactly this same moment of transition, a novel called El Indio wins the Premio Nacional de Literatura, which is set up by Abelardo Rodriguez. It's one of these sort of odd things, and in the context of the set as well. And this novel very much sets out the problems of rural Mexico, but doesn't have a solution. So it's almost handing over to the next president a sort of, this is the state of play, what can you do about it? And I think it is this moment of change and transition waiting for Cardenas to come and take power, which we might be seeing in lots of ways being channeled through the set.
So, Paul Strand, I looked at a lot of this stuff, but he had a letter from Cardenas that was framed, and I found it in its frame in the Center for Creative Photography in Tucson. And so obviously Strand prized it in advance for his work. It's a letter dated from 1939. So the way that I see it, and the film was released in Mexico in 1936, so Cardenas was not in power while it was being made, came to power subsequently, and then the film was actually received rather well in Mexico once the administration had changed. But I think it captures some of the tensions with the corruption of the revolution in the 1920s. You know, the joke was that the revolution empowered peasants who had become generals to become millionaires, but it was falling short of its goal. So I see the film as sort of a dissident statement within a transitional moment that was subsequently realized.
I think it's my terrible duty now to draw this discussion to a close, but only temporarily, as we're going to go on to the next session, which is precisely about film and filmmaking in post-revolutionary Mexico. So I'm sure some of these issues will be further discussed afterwards. But I'd just like to end by thanking the panel very much.
That's, no, I expect it to take 5 and then
That's what I would say.
So,